where you are right now. So on behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and the Habitat Forum, let me welcome you all to our Wednesday seminar. We have with us today a panel of very distinguished speakers who will be discussing the topic, the financialization of Chinese cities and the real estate industry. Before introducing the speakers, we would like to extend our very sincere thanks and appreciation to Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay for putting this panel together. Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay is Honorary Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies and Senior Fellow at the Policy Research Center, New Delhi. We'd also like to extend our appreciation to the Habitat Forum for partnering with ICS for this event. Coming to the speakers, we have with us Professor Fulong Wu, Bartlett Professor of Planning and Joint Coordinator of China Planning Research Group at University College London. We have Dr. Tao Wang, Managing Director and Head of Asia Economic Research at UBS Global Research. And finally, our final speaker, Dr. Yue Cheng, Associate Professor of Political Science and Affiliated Faculty of Global Asian Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. We are also joined today by Mr. Kirti Shah, Founder, President, Habitat Forum. Mr. Kirti will be giving us the concluding remarks for today. Now, before I invite Professor Partha to begin with the proceedings, let me lay out the housekeeping rules. All the participants, except the speakers, are requested to mute their audios. Participants are requested to send in their queries to the chat box or the raise hand option. Please unmute yourself only when the moderator will call upon your name to do so. I will now invite Professor Partha to kindly begin with the proceedings.
Thank you so much, Preksha. I also extend Ambassador Khan's apologies for not being able to be here today since he's taken ill, and wish him a speedy recovery. And also add my words of welcome to the speakers on behalf of the Institute for Chinese Studies and the Habitat Forum. The structure is we will have each of the three panelists. Dr. Wang is yet to join us, but we are expecting her to do so shortly. Make opening remarks, and subsequent to that, perhaps one question from me to sort of structure the interaction between the three of them, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. Please continue to type in the questions so that I'm able to take in group them thematically and pose them to the speakers as it goes forward. So that's the broad plan as we go forward. So let me begin by introducing Professor Fulong Wu. His biography will be in the chat box extended. It's already there in the invitation. It will also be extended there in the chat box next to you. But he is arguably one of the most prolific writers on Chinese cities and a sort of doyen in the field of China urban studies. Currently looking at the China Urban Planning Group at Bartlett at the University College of London, and has recently sort of worked extensively in the topic that we are currently going to be discussing today, which is the financialization of Chinese cities. Professor Wu and I were fortunate to be together in New York a few years ago under the aegis of the India-China Institute. And very fond memories and much that I've learned in that interaction since. Professor Wu, the floor is yours. And you have about 20 minutes. And I'll let you know if and when that time comes about. Fulong, all yours.
Thank you, Pater. So nice to see you again. I still remember wonderful days in New York visit. Anyway, it's nice to see you virtually. Let me show my screen. Okay, so first of all, I must clarify that I'm not a real estate expert. I guess probably a lot of you are interested in China's recent real estate events and major changes. But my talk will basically provide some background information about China's urban development, especially recent financialization issues. And for more information, probably you can look at our webpage, urbanchina.org. So my talk is basically based on several papers. A paper on assetization and China's housing financialization, and also land financialization, and the role of state in the process of financialization, and recent changes, especially the national political mandates guiding urban redevelopment. So basically, I'm going to talk about 5 stories. Yeah, I tell you 5 stories and try to make sense of urban financialization. Let me briefly introduce China's urban development related to financialization. China initiated economic reform in 1979. But in 1997, the Asian financial crisis occurred, and China has adopted rather radical or dramatic measure to commodify its housing sectors in order to rescue domestic consumption. But in 2008, the global financial crisis occurred again. China initiated the fiscal stimulus package, and that from there, you can see the financialization of the city. But recent years, we have seen China's has made great effort to regulate financial risks. So the first story is about housing. And I would like to talk about assetization as a China's pathway to housing financialization. I should say that China's urban development and real estate development is not purely out of speculation, because before the economic reform, there was a period of acute housing undersupply. And therefore, there was a backlog of unmet demand for decent housing. And housing reform has initiated to unleash this market demand. Secondly, in the 2000s, you have seen rapid urbanization in China, and therefore it stimulated that kind of a demand. Thirdly, and housing consumption is inevitable and featured prominently in China's spectacular economic growth. And therefore, you can see there's a strong desire and need to invest in housing. And because this is also amplified by the lack of comprehensive social security system, and Chinese households wanted to invest in housing as an asset to organize their asset-based welfare to get some security for the future. And home ownership provides some hedge against the future financial risks. So you can see that Chinese households invested quite heavily, actually turned their savings into housing purchases. But overall, you can see land supply has been quite limited in this fast urbanization process. There's also strong demand for new type of housing, which resulted in a sustained housing boom and rising prices. So these kind of things put together, it fuel the value creation through the housing market. So Chinese household has turned their investment saving into investment. So I wouldn't say it's purely speculative, because for a long time, a housing mortgage, it was still quite low comparatively in terms of international comparative standards. So that story was slightly different from Americans' subprime crisis. But over years, you can see the housing mortgage has increasing quite rapidly. And actually, there's no point to buy a house to rent out, because the rental income is really relatively modest, so that yield is low. But Chinese households wanted to do that because it want future asset appreciation. So that's the first story. The second story is you can see the housing financialization, because real estate make a profit and the municipal government sell the land use rights to developers, which generate income or revenue for municipal government. And that story, or the story of land-based finance, has been well known. So everyone knows the land-based finance, but probably people pay little attention to the other side of the story. Actually, it's quite costly to develop land. So sometimes actually municipal government did not make a substantial income from a land development. But why municipal government still want to do that? Because land is become valuable, and you can use land as a kind of asset to mobilize finance. So the land mortgage become a very important source of income, source of means to mobilize finance. Professor Liu in People's University, in his investigation, he said a lot of local government actually didn't make a lot of money from land, but actually they still want to do that because they can use land to raise capital. And that starts the whole process of financialization. My third story is about financialization, financializing the Chinese city, but not as a global or international capital circuit. It's more about crisis management. The Chinese government manages the impact of global financial crisis in 2008. The government initiated a 4 trillion yuan stimulus package and tried to finance development to cope with financial crises. But where was the money? The central government didn't hand out money. It really required a local government to provide matching fund, and local government had to find money through financial means, through setting up local government financial vehicles and using land as collateral to raise that kind of capital, which has led to this government debt. So the fourth story, developer also know this process and try to borrow and develop and make a profit. But actually, the developer sector or real estate sector has been controlled for some time. So developer, in terms of their formal loans or the bank loans, it has always been kept under 20%. So developer could not actually borrow a lot formally. The developer has to raise fund through so-called self-raised fund approach or non-standard approach, and also using the deposit from house buyers. In China, there is a house pre-sale system, which means actually you just pay before you actually finally get the money, the house. So because of this, you can see the financial source has been quite diversified, and some developers actually quite aggressively use this self-raised approach. and including raising money from the international capital market. Now, the fifth story, tide has changed. In 2017, President Xi Jinping in the 19th National Congress of Chinese Communist Party announced that housing is for living, not for speculation. Because in China, you have seen a significant social conflict during demolition and real estate boom. And for example, the picture actually shows inner city neighborhood in Guangzhou. It has been listed as an exemplar to preserve the old neighborhoods, not to initiate large-scale demolition to create a growth machine dynamics. And in this process, you see the state politics become very influential, and the state national political mandate exert its influence. And increasingly, you see there's an effort to manage financial risks. And one of the policy is to regulate real estate debt. And in 2020, last year, you see the three red lines have been initiated. That you need to control the debt. And if you cross over these three red lines, you are not allowed to have additional borrowing. And that change make a lot of changes. So my reflection on the whole story is that all started from global financial crisis in 2008. People pay a lot of attention to recent events in China, but they forgot. Actually, it has been related to a long time ago, 2008 global financial crisis. And also financialization is state efforts to manage its various external challenges. And also it has been created by specific conditions in Chinese cities. Some sort of speculation, but not entirely speculation. So it's a combination of genuine demand for housing quality, high quality housing, as well as kind of speculation. And some private sector developers are more aggressive in their financial strategies, and they expect a constant boom and to rescue to make a fortune, but they probably didn't pay sufficient attention to the changing tide, and they certainly will suffer in the processes. Thank you. I stop there, and for more information, you can look at our urbanchina.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fulong. That was very succinct and very brief. If I can just, before I turn to Yue, if I can just quickly ask you one question about the pre-sales that you spoke about. It is something that we also have here in India. We have recently in India started something called RERA, which is Real Estate Regulatory Authority, which tries to ensure that all the money that the developer collects from the pre-sales is spent on the project and not on something else. Is there any similar system in China at this point in time?
Yes, I think so, but that's through audit. But I think the main effort at the moment is to clarify the roots of financial borrowing and to set some requirement, and that's the main effort inside China. Basically, control the irregular borrowing and borrowing, for example, using land to borrow multiple times and using various of non-standard means.
Thank you. Yue, if I can now turn to you to You've already heard me refer to this similarity between the Indian and the Chinese real estate market, at least in one dimension, but in your way of looking at Indian and Chinese cities, you must have a much broader perspective on this. So the floor is yours. UA is, as I've said earlier, currently associate professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and also the editor of Urban Affairs Review. You'll have a more detailed bio in the chat box, but most importantly, UA has, of course, we have known her as she's done her research in India, but has also done work on the other big country in South America, which is Brazil. And so she has a comparative perspective across cities in 4 major countries, and the floor is all yours.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Partha. Let me first share my screen. All right. Are you able to see the full screen now?
No, yes.
Okay, great. Yes, so thanks so much, Partha, for the invitation. I feel very honored to be part of this panel together with Professor Wu and also other leading experts. And so I'm actually a really big fan of Professor Wu Fulong's work on China. So Professor Wu, it's really great to see you again after so many years having a conference together. And I really look forward, to the discussion. I also really want to thank all the audience because I saw some familiar names and faces in the audience, especially some friends, colleagues in India. So it's great to see you all, and that really brings lots of good memories for when I was doing field work in Mumbai and in Delhi. I must also say that I'm not the expert on the issue of financialization, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the issue of a particular type of real estate development in China. That's the redevelopment of urban villages. So hopefully we can use this as a micro level lens for understanding the bigger issue of Chinese cities, financialization, and the real estate market, especially after Professor Wu's really, macro level picture. So hopefully, my story can provide some detailed, information on this development at the local level. This is also part of my ongoing book project, comparing the governance of informal settlements in China, India, and Brazil. Okay. So I have some figures here for you. I'm sure, we're all familiar with this, but I think it's important to put China's urbanization in its global context. Although urbanization is one of the most important phenomena in the world, China's pace and the scale of urbanization is most impressive in the past few decades. And I want to emphasize that this is not only, large number of people moving in from the rural areas to cities, like 260 million people have moved from rural areas to cities in the past 40 years. But also cities in China are becoming larger and larger. So 20 of the world's 100 largest cities are in China. And meanwhile, there is this really impressive infrastructure boom, such as the development of the high-speed rail. And if we look at China together with other developing countries, okay, so these are the 3 cases I'm studying for the book project. And you can see for China, India, and Brazil, those 3 major emerging economies, they have all experienced rapid economic growth together with urbanization in the past decades. Brazil has a very high level of urbanization, it's almost 87%. and India was over 30%, China was nearly 60%. But China's pace of urbanization again was the fastest, and also really high level of economic growth. Then there is a rich body of literature, like Professor Wu just mentioned, to understand how urbanization takes place in China at such a pace and a scale. If we look into the literature, we will see there seems to be this consensus among scholars that China is actually undergoing a dual track urbanization. So there are two tracks going on together. On the one hand, we see there is a state-led track of urbanization. So along this track, local governments have actively promoted urban expansion and infrastructure development through the expropriation of rural land. And so this is a story that many scholars have written about. And this is largely a result of China's fiscal policy. So as we know, China has this unitary fiscal system. So under this system, the power over revenue, control over revenue was largely controlled by the central government. However, the local government shares lots of responsibility for the expenditure. So there is a huge gap for the local governments, huge fiscal gap. What they do is they will sell the land, to put it in a very simple way. But more so, they begin to fill the gap by borrowing money via these local government financial vehicles. In other words, they use land as collateral to collect money. So under this logic, we see that the government is using land as the source for generating revenue, and that pushes this rapid, spatial development and infrastructure development. But that's not the complete story, actually. So another side of the story is there is also this informal track of urbanization. We know actually, urban informality is a really important phenomenon, not only in China, but India, Brazil, lots of, developing countries. So in China, after the local government took over, expropriate the agriculture land from villagers, the villagers actually still have their homesteads, the village themselves. So they will build rental housing on their homestead and then rent those rental housing to migrant workers who work in the city but don't have access to the affordable housing or services because of their hukou status. They don't have the local household status. Again, this track has also been examined by scholars over decades. But if we put the two together, I think we can have a more complete picture in the sense that the state-led track of urbanization supplies land and capital to the government for urbanization, whereas the informal track supplies labor, or it helps the government to accommodate larger amount of migrant workers in the city with very low cost from the government, because the services were basically provided to them by the villagers. So in the rest of my presentation, I'm going to focus on the second one, because we already heard lots from Professor Wu, about this, state's role in this process. So I'm going to talk about how this informal track works, especially the recent redevelopment of the urban villages as a specific type of real estate industry in China. And these urban villages are very prevalent in major Chinese cities, in Beijing, Shanghai, or Chengdu, there are many, but they are especially important in China's Pearl River Delta region, where some of the important special economic zones are located. And I'm going to talk about particular city there, Guangzhou. Okay, so for those of you who are not very familiar with the geography of China, you see on the smaller map, you will see the location of the Pearl River Delta in southeast part of China. And another map shows you, the Guangdong province. And the Pearl River Delta is part of Guangdong province. It's highly, vibrant economic area in China. And Guangzhou, city of Guangzhou, in the center, it is the capital city of Guangdong province. Guangdong has a really high level of GDP. Like, for instance, in year 2020, the GDP level for Guangdong was 1.6 trillion US dollars. And for the past 30 years, it has constantly been the richest province in China. Okay, so if you walk around in the city of Guangzhou, especially in the city center, you actually often see, scenarios, scenes like this, those urban villages. So like I mentioned earlier, these are the villages encircled by urban expansion. So when the local government expropriate the agricultural land from the villagers, they left along the villages themselves. So what the villagers do is they build rental housing on their collectively owned collectively owned village land, and then rent those housing to migrant workers. So this kind of housing construction is not subject to any planning regulation. That's why we call this informal arrangements. And actually, I have to say this urban village is not unique to China, right? Because I'm sure friends in India know there are also urban villages in Guangzhou, in India. I remember I visited several of them when I was doing fieldwork in Delhi. So for Guangzhou, the city population is nearly 15 million, and 38% of the urban population lives in these kind of urban villages. And the majority of them, like I mentioned, are the migrant workers without local hukou. But a very interesting thing in urban villages in China is that after the local government expropriates the agricultural land, they actually will return some land to the villagers, the so-called economic development land. So as you know, in China, urban development, can only take place on urban land, not on rural land. But the government actually allows the villagers to build collective properties on this economic development land, like maybe restaurants or some other commercial facilities or factories even, so that they can collect rents or other income from the properties on the economic development land. So you see this kind of institution actually institutionalizes, it actually helps the urban villages to survive. In terms of the internal governance, all the villages, each of them will have a village committee elected by people from the village. There is also this shareholding company developed in almost all the urban villages during the 80s to manage the collective property. And oftentimes we see, people on the village committee, they're also the officials in the shareholding company. So it's basically same group of people. And then all the villages also have very strong clan network. So again, there's this overlap between those, official titles and, their status in the village, as a senior member in their clan. So this is how it looks if you walk inside the urban village. You see, again, it's quite similar to the scenes in the urban villages in Delhi that I saw. The buildings are very close to one another, so they are called handshaking buildings. You can shake hands, with someone through the window. And last time when I was there, I heard it's called kissing buildings. I guess you can also kiss someone through the window. And all the villages, they have, each of them would have a, main street market, as you see from the photo, where you can buy almost everything, and people can really have their daily needs met in the villages. Okay, so now let's talk about the redevelopment. So Guangzhou municipality started the redevelopment of urban villages back in 2009. This decision was supported by the provincial and the national governments. So the goal is to redevelop all the 139 urban villages in Guangzhou. There is a larger national context I want to talk about. So first of all, there was the reduced land supply in China around 2008. Basically, there's not too much land, so the government needs to recycle the land that has already been used. And secondly, Professor Wu also mentioned the financial crisis of 2008. That is very important event. So as a response to this global financial crisis, the Chinese government wanted to upgrade their urban economy. At the time, the party secretary of Guangdong province, Wang Yang, he set a policy, a strategy, really famously known as empty the cage and let the right birds in. So what does it mean? It basically means the goal is to create an environment suitable for high-tech and high value-added economy that will gradually replace the labor-intensive processing industries in the Pearl River Delta region. So in order to do so, they also want to change, the housing situation, the urban environment in the city. So that's why the redevelopment of urban villages was on the agenda. Okay, now let's take a look at how it's worked out. So that's really related to, the theme of this panel about the real estate industry in China. So the approach of urban redevelopment in Guangzhou is highly decentralized. So there is this municipal bureau of urban renewal, to approve all the projects. But the decisions in terms of which developer can get the project, are able to work with the villagers, is all up to the negotiation between the developers and the villagers. So usually according to the policy, the developer needs to have the consent of at least 80% villagers in order to be selected. And in reality, we know that it's not always so democratic. So there's can be, corruption, bribery, especially, the village officials, shareholding companies and the village committees play a really important role in the decision making. Another very interesting thing I want to emphasize is that
if I can just quickly ask a clarification. When you say consent of 80% of villagers, you mean people who are the original villagers, not the migrants who are staying in the village, right?
Absolutely, Partha. That's a good question indeed. So that's only the villagers who are from this village, who have legal title to the land, and not the tenants. Although, in some villages, you will find 80% of the people living there actually are the migrant workers, but they have no say in this process. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so, this is actually a highly profit deal if you think about it, right? Because many villages, they are centrally located. And also when the city is short of land, that's maybe the only way to go. So many developers want to get into this business. However, the urban redevelopment, in these urban villages has been monopolized by a few large development companies in Guangzhou. And I would say that's a very common situation in China. So for instance, in Guangzhou, there are 5 major real estate companies. They are called 5 South China Tigers because of their market share, their capital. And also among all those large real estate companies, state-owned enterprises, actually in my research, I found are the most important actors in this kind of development industry. It's actually easy to understand because the SOEs has the support from the government so that they are favored by the local government as more credible. They are also favored by the banks because the banks consider they are able to pay off, they are able to finish the projects. And I remember one of the, the leading official in one of the largest SOE working in urban village redevelopment in Guangzhou told me after they got this permission to do this project in one urban village, the banks reach out to them, so offer them to give them loans. So as you can see, this really interesting dynamics between this real estate industry and the bank, related to different types of companies, of course. So also one of the central state-owned enterprise, Poly Real Estate, maybe some of you heard of that, was part of this SOE, was actually specialized in military manufacturing in the old days. But their company owns the largest amount of urban land in Guangzhou. So it's a major player in the process of urban redevelopment. in the city. So actually, you can see the interesting dynamic is that although on the surface you see this, market-based economy, but actually down to the earth, the state actually still controls major resources and market opportunities, especially in the real estate industry. Okay, so again, the local government really want to make this happen. So they provide lots of preferential policy for the developers. So for instance, for other type of redevelopment projects, you need to provide 40% of your assessed land value to the government as land transaction fee. So like we mentioned, and that's how the local government makes money. But for this kind of urban village redevelopment, you only need to provide 20% of the assessed land value. Okay, so after the developer has the permission to do the project, the process actually becomes more contentious. So although there are general principles in terms of how much compensation the villagers can receive, in reality, the villagers, actually the developers will negotiate with the villagers household by household in order to make them agree to sign a contract. So developers call this one village, one policy. The process can sometimes take as long as 8 or 10 years, but again, the profit was very high. Sometimes it can be, 40, 50%, or even 100, 300%. Because the process is so contentious, make people think about China's rapid, radical, violent land reform back to the 50s. So some people call the redevelopment of urban villages as the last land reform in China. Okay, so after the project is implemented, we will see the outcome is some high density residential and commercial development. Basically, developers will tear down the old village and build, lots of condominiums for the villagers as compensation units. And then they will use the rest of the land to build market rate, more luxury housing and commercial facilities. And in order to increase the density, they often will, break this density control, this zoning control will often be relaxed by the local officials. And then villagers, they will get really multiple condos, dozens sometimes. So they become this new housing class. But the migrant workers, like I mentioned earlier, they have no say in this process and they have to be displaced. Many of them have to move to other villages further away from the center of the city. Now I want to quickly show you a few photos that I took during my fieldwork. So this is, after the redevelopment, you can see the density is very high. And there is actually a very funny little gate in front of all the high-rise, just to symbolize, it was a historical village before. And those photos are taken in the Pazhou village after the redevelopment. Again, you can see there are some upscale housing commercial facilities, like the photo on the upper left-hand side. You see the shop, you see the commercials, some shops. So these are all the properties built for the villagers by the developers. So again, after the redevelopment, they still own some collective properties. They can still receive the dividends from the properties. So it's a pretty good deal for the villagers. And then the photo on the lower right-hand side shows you some advertisement, for the price of, renting some, condos in this new community. It's usually 5 or 8 times higher than the previous price if you rent a unit in the urban village. And this is another urban village. So you can see, again, the photo on the left shows you the entries, right? So we see this gate, the traditional gate. And the photo on the right was actually when the developer welcomes the villagers to move back to this new community. And something really funny on the banner, it says, to own multiple condos is not as good as owning a hotel. So basically the developer built a hotel for the villagers as their collective property. So they are able to, have more income, constant income from this collective property. So like Partha mentioned, I've been doing research, studying the redevelopment of the informal settlements in India and in Brazil as well. I don't think I have time to talk about those in detail, but this pattern of the redevelopment in China's informal settlements is dramatically different from what I see in India and in Brazil. For instance, I'm sure some of you know, Mumbai also has this city-level redevelopment of urban villages. But the slum dwellers don't get this kind of compensation, and the standard for compensation is also the same for all the households in Mumbai. Every family will have a compensation unit, but the size is 25 square meters, no matter what the size the family is. Okay, like I mentioned, all the villages have very strong clan network. So they used to have, the old ancestral shrine in the village. So after the redevelopment, the developers actually will rebuild the shrines for the villagers. The photo on the top shows you, it is in one of the urban villages after redevelopment. So this village has 4 major family names. So the developer built 4 shrines, 1 for each family name. And when I was there, I was very curious, how people use this kind of community space. So I sneaked into one of the shrines. Then I saw the photos at the bottom. You see there are some senior villagers. They were playing mahjong there, because usually people, the story was people would make lots of money from redevelopment. But they have no other ways to spend. So they would, have this kind of entertainment. Okay, I want to offer some reflections based on the story. We can see that this kind of redevelopment of urban villages is a unique type of real estate industry in China. But in order to understand, the mechanisms behind that, we really need to look into the financialization of Chinese. We really need to look into China's land regime and also the fiscal policy. And secondly, we see that the party plays a pretty important role in this, shaping this policy agenda. And also there is a strong intergovernmental coordination from the local to the provincial to the central, and has generated a pattern of urban governance in China where you have a high level of effectiveness, but the level of inclusiveness is fairly low because of very little participation. Also the migrant workers, they are marginalized in this process. And so that leads to the next observation, that the redevelopment of urban villages, it actually reproduces spatial and social inequalities. It actually even reproduces this urban-rural divide, if you think about it, right? Because those redeveloped communities, they are actually still on this rural, collectively owned land. So it's still actually urban, rural land in the middle of the urban land. So that's still actually very problematic or interesting situation. And finally, I think it urges us to think about what is the urban, what is the city. I know among Indian scholars, you also have this discussion how to define urban in India, right? It's very difficult. And same thing in China. We see this blurred boundary between the urban and the rural. So I think we need to consider urban as this reflection as the national strategy of development, and also the critical space for political negotiation. If I can use maybe 1 more minute, I want to briefly touch upon the recent development in China's real estate industry. So just to offer some general observation, one thing is that in 2017, the Chinese government announced a pilot project to allow the development of rental housing on rural land in 13 cities. Many people consider this as a major step, to recognize the legitimacy of rental housing in urban villages. And maybe, this is a way to integrate the urban villages into the cities. However, implementation of this is very minimal, it's very slow, because it's not favored by the local governments. That's because the local government doesn't want to give this right, to make money from the rental housing to the village collectivities. They also want to, participate in that. So the local governments, they want to create their own SOEs to deal with this rental housing. So that's actually in a conflict of interest with the village collectivity. So that's why this pilot project has not been actively implemented. Second, as you all know in the news, right, one of the biggest topic these days, the debt crisis of China's real estate industry, especially Evergrande has over $300 million debts. And if we take a look at the entire real estate sector in China, some experts say the debt level will reach $5 trillion. And at the same time, some people who study the ghost city will show you there's a high vacancy rate in China, especially in lower tier cities, as high as around 20%. So actually, all those together, you will see the distortions within China's land-based economy. So it's time probably for a change in order to have a more sustainable model of urban development. The Chinese government implemented this restriction on borrowing beginning since the end of last year, but we need to see how or whether it will have real impact. And finally, just a few days ago, the Chinese government announced they are going to implement a pilot real estate tax project in some regions. So there are no much detail, but we know it's likely to include wealthier regions and also regions with more economic diversity, such as Zhejiang and Guangdong. So I think will be something really interesting for us to watch. And just the last final words, I just talked to some of my friends in Guangzhou working in the real estate industry. They told me many of these development projects by Evergrande actually recently has been taken over by the state-owned enterprises in the city and in the province. So I think we probably would expect a more centralized state-owned type of urban economy in China. So I'm not surprised by that, but I think it will be interesting to see how things develop at the local level. I'm going to end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wei. That is a very detailed exposition of how development occurs in of centrally located real estate. And in the discussion session, I hope you and Dr. Wang and Professor Wu can also address how general this is. And also one of the issues that you raised at the end, which is the issue of a property tax and what the implications of that are for financing as we go forward. Let me now turn to our final panelist, Dr. Tao Wang, who is currently Managing Director at UBS based in Hong Kong. And a complete bio is in the chat box. But Dr. Wang is perhaps one of China's most listened to commentators on economic issues. And her perspective on how this real estate and the nexus of the cities and real estate link to the broader growth story, and what the implication of this is for broader growth in China, and whether or not this will affect the growth model going forward, is something that I hope she will address in her remarks. And then we will open up for discussion as we take it from there. Tao and I, we were fortunate to be classmates a long time ago when we were both graduate students at NYU. But this is the first time she's ever been on a panel that I have been moderating. So thank you so much, and look forward to listening to you as we take it from there. Floor is all yours, Tao.
Thank you, Pato. Thanks for inviting me. I've learned a lot, and I'm sorry I missed a bit in the front. So sorry if I repeated some of what Professor Wu speaks. So I just wanted to make 3 observations and maybe 1 question we can discuss about. The 3 observations are, first, obviously the property boom and the financial mechanisms related to it, land financing and so on, has been a big part of China's growth story and big part of the China growth model. The second observation is that it has success, but it also created many problems. And those include probably, as the 2 professors mentioned, over-construction in areas, ever-rising prices, perhaps too much resources and also too much risks surrounding the property sector, and also perpetuating the inequality, and they are no longer sustainable. So that's the third part, is that this growth model and this land financing model is not sustainable anymore. So the final question would be, what can China do about it? What's the consequence of that? The first point, I think it's relatively clear. China's property boom helped by land financialization and development of a private commodity housing market, urban housing market, has been really important in China's development in the past 20 years. And I would say it's the most important engine of growth, more so than exports to some extent in the last 20 years. In the first 20 years of China's reform, basically the 80s and 90s, we kind of knew that growth was mainly driven by economic liberalization, right? Agricultural land reform give people more freedom in deciding what to grow, factories freedom, what to produce, and companies and local governments, freedom to make their decision, introducing market forces and price mechanism, FDI, exports, those kind of things. A true private housing market, there was construction boom at that time as well, 80s and 90s, but really done by the state-owned enterprises and local governments, and then allocated and not quite a private housing market. A true private property market really developed in the last 20-odd years after the government accelerated the housing reform in the late 90s, by transferring the state housing first to the household. That's a big wealth transfer. But then also, I think that liberalization, allowing private individuals to own their property and allowing private companies to construct, that kind of mechanism happens to be happening in the period when China's economy was growing very fast. There was accumulation of private wealth. It was sitting largely as deposit since there was nothing else. And then, we had this boom. So, and people lived in very small and old, crummy, SOE built places in cities. So there was a huge amount of demand. There was the income, and now, private ownership was allowed, and private housing, more modern housing, was produced. So this, I think, led to obviously a big construction boom, and so that then led to demand for construction materials such as steel and cement, construction machineries. And China was, until that time, until the early 2000s, net importer. But this demand domestically then also led to huge capacity expansion in those manufacturing sector as well. And so China quickly become self-sufficient, and then importing machineries and finished goods turned into importing a lot of commodities. And China built its own capacity. And that capacity, I would say, those heavy industry capacity was to satisfy domestic housing construction boom rather than exports, right? So that's, I think that also helped to alleviate, for example, the SOEs that were in deep trouble in the late 90s. But the housing boom really helped them because then suddenly their goods have higher demand, higher prices. Their land also become valuable. Their NPLs become quickly sold off because you can just sell the land and so on. So this model, I think, so far so good. but this kind of growth model is really, I think, pushed to another level by two developments in the early 2000s. One is the change of land policy, and I'm sure Professor Wu and Professor Zhang had mentioned a bit, is that until actually the late 90s, collectively owned farmland can be used for non-agricultural use. But after the late 90s, it was no longer possible. It had to be procured or expropriated by urban government to become state-owned land. Then they can supply to the urban market. So in this process, the farmers basically lost their chance of enjoying the valuation gains of the land. The local governments gained it. And because they are the monopoly supplier of land to urban construction, so they had then strong incentives to, first of all, get as much land as possible. Secondly, supply the land in a monopolistic way to maximize the value of what they get from the land. So they, for example, if if the housing market is not so strong, then they reduce the land supply to push up the land price. And even when the final demand is not so good, they have some state-owned companies. They can have a transaction that makes the land price look good anyway. And this model so really accelerated urbanization, because the more land, the more areas, the urban areas expanded, the more land they procured from the farmers, then the more money they can make. And with those money, obviously, and they then sell to the developers and so on. With those kind of net gains, then they can do infrastructure or invest in property themselves. They can do a lot of things that accelerate the growth and development. And this then was added another sort of set of fuel in 2008 after the global financial crisis, when the government allowed local government to set up these investment platforms, local government financing vehicles, and use land as collateral and to borrow. And so that basically added another layer and therefore added even more incentive for local governments to do this. So it's been, to some extent, it's been very successful in that it really created a construction boom that probably have not been seen anywhere else that lasting for so long. But it also created problems, as I mentioned, because local government is a monopoly supplier and they artificially push up land prices. So first of all, that also pushed up the property prices. And property prices going up then incentivize more people to invest in property, not just satisfying their own need. And so especially in the last few years, last 5 to 10 years, I think, the demand investing in property as an asset allocation, as an investment demand has really increased. And so that then, you can say, probably creates a bubble, right? China's property bubble is very different in the sense that it is not like the US. The home buyers does not have so much leverage, as they put down at least 30%, but on average 40, 50% of their own equity. So it's not a zero down payment requirement. It's not that they cannot afford so easily, but it's that when you had so much wealth accumulated and pouring into an asset, as long as you think the price continue to go and you continue to pour into it, price continue to go up until one day it does not. And so I think that's one of the problems. The other problems, as I mentioned, when you have the construction boom, you create this demand for steel, for construction machinery, and so on, right? And everything looks fine. But if construction is too much and one day you correct, then suddenly these other sectors have too much capacity. So that's where the excess capacity comes in. And that will be a waste of capital. Another area, of course, property itself, the price continue to go up, and on balance sheet, look so pretty good, especially if you look at, a lot of the loans are collateralized by land and property. You think, oh, my asset liability ratio looks pretty good. But one day, maybe that asset needs to be repriced. And then that liability doesn't look so good. And that's especially on the corporate and government side. So it creates a lot of the problems. And the fundamentals of this property boom, I think in the beginning, it was supported by rapid income growth, by people wanting to upgrade their living space. In 1980s, the average living space in China was about 7 square meters. And in the late 1990s, maybe about 15 or so. Now it's 40. And so, and housing ownership is already very high, and the demographics is shifting. Fewer people, migrants are coming to the cities and so on. So the fundamentals doesn't support that, and increasingly is more of pushed by local governments, pushed by financing and so on. And too much resources have concentrated in property, not just from household, but also from the economy at large, because the growth model, very heavy industry-led, investment-led, centers around property boom. And urbanization also focused, Professor Zhang Yue mentioned, what is urban? In China, urbanization has been so much focused on the physical urbanization, meaning tall buildings and urban-like environment. But I think true urbanization, especially in China, needs to think about the lifestyle of people and also the public services and social safety net, like in urban areas. So I think basically we have come to a era that that some of the fundamentals that supported the construction boom is changing, is weakening. At the same time, I think this land fiscal linkage by local governments and their monopolistic behavior, then pushing up property price and then sucking in more resources, that's increasingly risky because there's so much debt around it. It's not just about developers' debt, that's very limited. Evergrande sounds like they have a lot of debt, right? It's very small compared to the total debt in China. It's not about the household debt either, because household balance sheet is not that alarming. It's not about those alone. There's also the debt of the local governments, of the construction material companies, of the heavy industry companies. To some extent, they're all linked to property. And in China, bank lending is very focused on using collateral rather than cash flow. So, roughly half of the loans in the banking system are collateralized by property and land, either collateralized or linked to property. So this is where the risk lies. I think the authorities have recognized the problem for some time. It's just that there's always a difficult balance because property is really important for growth. And if you want to really prick the property bubble, then you worry about the short term. And government officials, especially local governments, tend to be very short-term focused. So there's always the worry on that front. So it's been very difficult. Property tax, for example, has been in discussion for over 10 years. And supposedly in the last couple of years, it was going to come out. Finally, what we have announcement that we're going to have a new round of experiment, which means no legislation will come out in at least in the 5 years because we have to experiment first, right? So it's another delay to some extent. But I think the leadership in the last few years have shown that they are very worried and very aware of the issue. And the issues are multiple fronts. It's not just about debt. It's also about, I think, the wealth gap, not just income gap, but the wealth gap. Some estimates saying 10% of top 10% owns 85% of the wealth in China, and that's mainly property, right? And so if you own a property in Beijing and Shanghai, you're multimillionaires naturally. And also it creates a lot of social problems, the problems of farmers losing their land, not getting compensated, the problems of migrant workers losing their place to stay. When I lived in Beijing, it was around the GFC area, in surrounding my village, about 100,000 people lived there. And in a couple of months, they all disappeared because there's a redevelopment. And so they can no longer afford to live there. So there are lots of problems created in here. So they talked about, President Xi talked about, no speculation, and they did not stimulate the property sector even in the event of the pandemic and the trade war in the last couple of years. So they are gradually trying to diffuse the problem. And so, what to do, I think, is, what to do next is really the challenging part. It's basically no simple answer. We need to change the growth model. And that means gradually diffuse the property bubble and contain the financial risk. And so keep property speculation in check, keep property sector relatively stable. There will be some gradual land policy reform and allowing farmers to enjoy some of the benefits of land appreciation. Build more rentals so that young people come into the labor force, and migrant workers coming to cities can have a decent place to stay. There will be a gradual property tax, because with housing ownership more than 80% in urban areas, I think there will be extremely strong resistance to property tax. So the property tax will be really at the margin, and most people wouldn't have to pay. That's the only way that the society can accept it. And then at the same time, I think China would gradually change the growth engine a bit, moving a bit away. For example, there has been a focus on consumption. Obviously, property going down is bad for consumption in the short term. But in the longer term, I think the government talks about the common prosperity, right? You probably have heard about it in recent months. And for me, that means better social safety net. For example, expansion of pension and healthcare insurance, and better public services, especially in lower tier cities and rural areas, so that the kind of demand for housing, so that you can send your kids to the best school there, or you can go to the best hospital there, that kind of demand also reduces. I think hukou reform will help as well in terms of consumption. And on the manufacturing side, one thing I forgot to mention, that the property-led growth model was very good for capital-intensive, heavy industry development, because it led to huge demand for their products and so on. But that, as I mentioned, that's not sustainable, and it's not been very good for labor-intensive industries, because property price just goes up, land cost for companies goes up. And when Professor Zhang talked about Guangdong Provincial Governor Wang Yang's policy, right? One motivation I cynically believe is that those manufacturers occupied, precious land. They want them to go out so they can take the land and redevelop them. And for a country with 1.4 billion people, you still need quite substantive manufacturing sector. So I think, they want to keep property price, stable, not go up further, and upgrading the manufacturing sector in terms of technology, greener development, focusing on, those kind of new areas. I guess the labor-intensive industries, China is losing out. There's no turning around. And then on the debt and financial risk, I think China will gradually reduce the risk. We talked about Evergrande a bit. I think local governments, I don't believe local governments are centralizing property development. It's just they are too big. No SOE alone or no private sector alone can take that over. But local governments are needed to make sure that the funding, whatever funding left, can be, they were supposed to be an escrow account, but of course they have been touched. Those funding can be used for the specific project they are meant to be, so that people who have already paid for the housing in the pre-sales will get their housing eventually. So there's not mass protest and social problems. And the migrant workers who work in those construction projects can be paid eventually, because they have been owed a lot of back wages and so on. So it is really about managing social stability and containing the risk. So that's one way to address those kind of issues. But at the same time, I think the government will also be pragmatic, ease some of the policies. We've already known that PPC have already confirmed, for example, they have eased mortgage quota a bit and made sure that developers get regular financing instead of, basically they ask banks not to withhold credit to developers and so on, so that there's a stable development. So I think this is going to be a long-term transition. It's not going to happen immediately. If it does happen immediately, we are going to have a hard landing in the economy, and that obviously will bring significant financial risk as well. So I will stop here. Be happy to discuss next.
Thank you, Tao, for taking the discussion to also talking about the growth of the Chinese economy and where these structures can put together. Let me now sort of take that question. One of the issues that seems to have come up both in your presentation as well as that of UA is this issue of the property tax. And I see that also Hemant has a question about it. Professor Wu, if I could just ask you one specific question and one broader question. One specific question being, what is the story around the property tax? Why has there been so much debate around it? And of course, other panelists can sort of obviously come in to answer that question also, in terms of the pros and cons of that particular structure. And it's something that is very interesting for us in India, because even though within the ICS community, perhaps it is less so, but in the broader community of people who will be looking at this video and watching this, the perception is the Chinese state can do whatever it wants. And to realize that it's taking such a long time over a reform like this is helpful for us to understand the character of the Chinese state, which I think is important for a lot of us to understand that story. And the second is a broader question, Professor Wu, if you could address it, which is, as Tao sort of pointed out, it looks as if this model, which you also discussed, of financialization and therefore the growth of the Chinese city, is sort of coming to an end. So what implication does that, do you agree, first of all, with that assessment? And B, what implication does that have for the future of the Chinese city going forward? Professor Wu?
Thank you for your question, Patrick. And as I said, I'm not a real estate expert, so I guess there are other experts who can answer this question. But I just briefly answer these questions. Some are just my guess. And for the first question about property tax, the issue has been debated for a long time, but now it's beginning a new era to experiment. And I can think the major concern is its implication for a property market. And what exact impact on property market is unknown. Therefore, it should be experimented and to see. And so the government, I guess, wishes a soft landing, so to regulate development and to reduce property speculation and increase housing affordability. That's a purpose, but not just to make the boom bust. And the second question, what will be changed? I think, as you know, in the government document of policy, the aim is to control speculative property booms and to divert or relocate some resources into production, because China has been a manufacturing industry for a long time, country for a long time. But real estate speculation, as Tao Wang said, has actually really diverted resources, capital into the real estate speculation. And therefore, the major change would be the encouragement for high value added manufacturing, the technology, green technology, for example, high value added industry as well. So I guess that's my answer, but it's highly uncertain. So I don't know for sure. Okay, thank you.
If you actually move to that kind of industry, would that change the nature of the city in any way? I mean, the city currently in China, in some sense, is based, even sort of cities like Shenzhen, which have very high levels of services, have a very strong manufacturing base. If the economy shifts, as you sort of just spoke about, do you see any changes in the city taking place?
I think technological innovation will still be an important sector, and including services, producer services, for example, will still be important direction. And I think I forgot to mention that there's another financial source opening up for the local government. That is a local government bond. Previously, the local infrastructure development is heavily relied on land value capture, and which actually relied on a booming property market. And increasingly, the government wanted to closing the back door, that is the informal borrowing or non-standard borrowing from the property by property market, but to open the front door, that is allow the local government to borrow formally in the capital market. But that kind of borrowing is still regulated by upper level government through so-called a local government bond.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So it will be the provincial government which will sort of regulate the county level and the city level government's issue of these local government bonds.
There are some details. It's probably too complicated to elaborate that. This involves basically the central government allocation quotas and provincial government to monitor and to approve, and local government to propose profitable or viable projects. So it's quite complicated. But we are, with my doctoral student, we are publishing a paper in regional studies very soon on the local government bond. I'll be happy to share that with people, with you later.
Thank you so much. I can see where UA has her apprehensions about greater government involvement in the sort of evolution of the Chinese city. I'll turn to you later, but if I can quickly come back to you, Tao, to sort of build on Professor Wu's response. On this issue of the property tax, as he said, he felt one of the issues was that the government was worried it might disrupt the property real estate boom that was taking place. But now that that boom is over, or if the boom is over, does that make it a better time to experiment with property taxes? Or is the government worried that because you now have to prop up the real estate market, this is again a bad time? So it's like heads you win, tails I lose kind of story. That's on the property tax. And on the broader issue of, you broadly alluded to it as to moving away from real estate as a growth driver to new technologies and structures. Do you see green technologies, especially with COP26, etc., coming up? Do you see that being a big part of the story? Is that something that you're hearing from the that you sort of see as having potential, or is it too small a piece of the puzzle to be able to actually act as a strong engine of growth in China? Tao?
Thank you. So on property tax, it's always not a good time. And because they always worry that when it's boom, they think a property tax will kill the boom. And when the boom is over, when property is going down, that's obviously not a good time because it will make it even much worse, right? But I think, so the announcement recently just shows that at least politically, the top leadership is very strong on this. So at least they have to pay homage to that, to say at least we're moving forward on the property tax. But there are basically strong resistance from all kinds of quarters. So worried about property market is a very good excuse, very good reason. But also, so people argue that because the land, urban land in China is state-owned, you own the house, but you don't own the land below it, and therefore, why should I be taxed? So that's that's our argument. And also, people would say when you sold property to me, implicitly with a high land price, you kind of already implicitly taxed me. And so that's there's argument from scholars that way. But fundamentally, with 80-90% of housing ownership, nobody wants to pay more tax, right? So there are strong resistance, and especially from civil servants and officials who tend to own multiple properties in city centers and have very little cash flow because they don't earn much wage. And so there's strong resistance within the system as well. And the local government, of course, local government would like to have property tax as a good source of revenue, but at the same time, they want to still sell land. But there's no such good things. And so central government said maybe land property tax can be a good stable source of local revenue, and over time that's a good stream of local revenue, and land sales can go down. But local governments, as I mentioned, focus on the short term. I'd rather sell $1 trillion or $2 trillion this next few years rather than having a few $100 billion a year for the next 10 years that I will no longer be governing here. So I think there's also all kinds of resistance. So to answer your earlier question about how China's government work, I think it doesn't, China's state, the central government obviously has more power than probably elsewhere, including India, but still, I think there are different stakeholders and different interest groups within the system that are, working against each other, not just with each other. So that's one important reason why property tax has been delayed for so long. In terms of, I just want to follow up on your question to Professor Wu about, if this growth model changes, will the nature of the city changes somewhat? I think just to go back to what Professor Zhang mentioned a bit, I think as local government, no longer can just forever expanding the area of their city and get more land and sell more land and so on, they would have to think about redevelopment of urban areas like these urban villages in the city centers, and in areas like Beijing city, is the size of Belgium, right? And there are land that can be redeveloped and so on. So I think they need to focus on redevelopment and increase the efficiency of land use, especially industrial land use as well. And also increasingly focusing on services and public transport and those kind of and other soft public infrastructure. And so I think that will change. On the other industries, on the green development is definitely an area. So just green technology or renewables and so on itself is not a big part. But I think that I would include also environmental cleanup and retrofitting the old system and so on. So there's I think even refocusing the transport system from a car driven road highway driven system to more about public transport itself is also more green. So I think it's not going to obviously be a replacement of property, but I think it can definitely contribute and support growth. But over the longer term, I think the fundamentals that no longer support a property boom also meant that they no longer support the kind of growth we have seen in China. China's potential growth is slowing because of aging populations and because urbanization, in terms of 75% of the employment is already in non-farming and so on, that's slowing. And so all of these means that potential growth is coming down. So it's not a replacement.
Yue, if I can just ask you to respond to one of the questions that Hemant has raised, and then I'll take it to Professor Wu, and also to sort of ask you about how you see the future of the Chinese city. That's the general question. Going forward, given the changes that you yourself described. And also this whole question that seems to bother people, which is the notion of empty real estate. We have had the ghost city discussion in China for quite a long time now. But do you see this as being a phenomena going forward? And do you see something like that being overcome by the hukou reform and therefore more urbanization taking place in many of these places, especially outside the big metros, where you think a lot of the coast cities might actually get occupied if there is hukou reform for people to come in to these slightly the sub-major cities, not small cities, no, very few cities, lots of very large cities in China. But to what extent do you see that proposition working out going forward? Yue?
Okay, great. Thanks, Partha, for the question. I also want to thank all the audience for your questions in the chat box. I answered a few, but it's difficult to listen speaking while you're typing, so I'm not able to answer all of them in the chat box. But I'll try to address some major ones, including the ones Partha just mentioned. So the second question first. Partha, if I understand your question correctly, your question is about the future for the vacancy, right? For the empty cities, how China is going to deal with that. Is that the question?
Yes, that is one.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So in terms of that, I think currently the vacancy level is very high. Actually, not in the first tier or second tier cities, more in the third, fourth or even fifth tier cities, and also cities at not very desired locations, because in many places the government thought this housing development will motivate people to move there. They also expect to have some industrial development there, but apparently it didn't happen because people are not only driven by the availability of housing, right? They care about the entire welfare system, education, and healthcare, and also of course job opportunities. So currently we see that the construction has slowed down due to all the factors we have discussed. So I think that probably will help with the vacancy rate a little bit, because the supply of housing will possibly be slowed down. But the thing is how you deal with the current housing stock. And I think maybe the policy in larger cities to reduce the density of population. For instance, Shanghai and Beijing, they have this policy to reduce urban density. I think that probably will encourage more people to either go back to their hometown or go to those smaller or medium-sized cities. So possibly that will help a little bit. But I think it probably will take a long time for the housing market to be completely balanced in terms of the demand of the people. And I also want to address, and yes, of course, Partha also mentioned the hukou reform, and I know Dr. Wang also mentioned that. That's certainly a critical issue for how China has developed in this pattern. Also, we know there are different waves of hukou reform, and currently we see the regulation has been relaxed in many cities. In some cities, like the Pearl River Delta, for instance, if you are talents, if you can provide capital, you are able to have residency there. But it is still firmly controlled in some of the first-tier cities, including Beijing and Shanghai. So I expect a more relaxed hukou system, at maybe the medium or lower tier cities. But for the top ranked cities, I think that will still be very difficult. I also want to quickly address the previous question Partha asked about my perception about the future of Chinese cities or Chinese economy in general. Our two other panelists have offered already some excellent insights. I just want to mention, I think economic transition is really high on top of Chinese policymakers' agenda, but it's very difficult. I think there are three major difficulties to have this kind of economic transition to a more value-added or technology-based. One thing is, I think Dr. Wang also mentioned, that's the aging issue. Chinese society is aging rapidly, especially in major cities. I searched a little bit for all the three countries I'm studying. The median age of Indian population, guess how much is that? It is 28 years old. And Brazil, 33 years old. And China is 38 years old. So you see 38, it doesn't sound too old, right? However, that's the medium at the national level. And if you look at the major cities where the healthcare system is better and some of the retirees want to stay, then the aging issue is very severe in major urban areas, and also people tend to live longer. So I think that's a major obstacle. A second one is the children of the migrant workers. So we know there's a huge number of migrant workers living in cities, but they don't really have the legal title to all the rights. And then many of their children are either born in cities or they were, they came to cities with their parents. Many of them were not able to receive quality education. They also don't have those equal rights as their peers in the, born in the urban areas. And they don't want to go back to their hometown either. So the question is, how do you deal with such a huge, young migrant population who are not able to go back and who also doesn't really fit into the city, the urban economy either? I think that's a major issue for China in the future. And the last one is, if we talk about China's economic transition, we need to think about entire global phenomena in terms of the US-China competition, right? We know the Biden government's policy try to boost the infrastructure development in the US, and some policies particularly targeting on China, try to limit China's international competitive power. So I think the trade policy and also the technology policy, they will all have huge impact on China's future economic transition. And the last point I want to make, Partha mentioned, future for Chinese cities. I think it's also one of the audience also asked about the political issue. I think the number one concern for Chinese policymakers is political stability. So the economy also serves the purpose of maintaining their governance. I would say the Chinese authoritarian regime is pretty resilient, as it has been studied in lots of literature. So there's this authoritarian resiliency theory, and also the adaptiveness of the Chinese Communist Party. I would call the Chinese authoritarian regime as a porous authoritarianism, in the sense that it is authoritarianism, the role of party, this intergovernmental strong coalition. At the same time, the system is porous. Different non-state actors are able to negotiate with the state actors in various ways, as we see already in the urban village redevelopment. So I think those channels, informal negotiation, actually allows the regime to sustain a longer time. And also, I do see a strong, support in some of the population, including, the rising urban middle class, or even people who are in their, 50s and the 60s, who came from Mao's era, and they actually still feel, strongly for the party's control, or even some nationalism sensation. I think those are contributes to the stability of the political system. So I think probably a soft landing, will be a really possible future for Chinese economy. Thank you.
Thank you. We are almost at the end of time. So can I ask the panelists to offer final closing remarks? I see most of the questions that have been raised have been answered so far. If there is one which has not been, please point them out to me. But let me begin in the order in which the presentations were made, with Fulong, Professor Wu first, and then final thoughts, Professor Wu, as we go forward. Do you think that this crisis, in your work, you have mentioned that reform, including the financialization process, was driven by external crises, by first the Asian financial crisis and then the global financial crisis. Do you see this as an internal crisis, and do you therefore see this again as an opportunity for change to happen in China, or any other issue that you might want to comment on during the structures?
Thank you, Patrick. And also thank you for the audience, particularly for those who are in India. And I think when you look at financializing Chinese cities, you need to understand not internal issues in China, but also external issues or external challenges, such as global financial crises. That probably requires us to have more comparative perspective, to think countries or economies and cities are related to each other. So I would hope in the future we could do a little bit more comparative studies. And I know Yue has done some comparative studies. I think that's a very interesting direction, and I certainly will pursue that direction when possible in the future. So thank you for your interest in Chinese cities.
Thank you. Tao, can I now turn to you with the same kind of question about final thoughts as you see this going forward, and do you see this as a watershed moment in China's broad growth story, or is this just another one of the blips in the long Chinese progress that we have seen since 1980? Tao? Is she there?
Yeah. Sorry, I was muted. That's a very good question. I think if there is a watershed moment, this happened before. We are in the middle of a longer-term transition. I think China started to realize that kind of growth model cannot be sustained soon after the global financial crisis, when they saw the after effect of that major stimulus and that model, and especially in 2015-16, when the property downturn led to excess capacity and debt problems. And then recently, I think Professor Wu is right. I think the geopolitical tension made it also clear that there needs to be change, and that so therefore there's a focus on developing domestic economy, make things more sustainable at home. And sustainable is not just economic development, it's very much political, social sustainability. And having 200 odd million people in between, not having the same status in your own country is a ticking time bomb, in my view. And it also means, so that urbanization, whatever it means, and we talked mainly about the physical part of the urbanization, but I think in the future, it has to be about the human part of the urbanization. It's about education opportunities, job opportunities, and public service opportunities, and so on. So that also means create jobs in those areas. And so I think we are starting to move in that direction. So it's not necessarily a watershed moment, but I think maybe developments in both COVID and geopolitical tensions in the last couple of years has amplified the need for the structural transition. So we are, moving in that direction.
Partha is muted, I think.
I'm sorry, how you're infectious. Yue, final thoughts? I can see that Prem is already sort of responding to your porous authoritarianism story and how that might actually help the process going forward.
Right. Well, thanks. Thanks for the comment. Indeed, that's actually a theory still underdeveloped. But like I mentioned, I think the key is there are various channels, sometimes informal channel, for the state and non-state actors to interact. And sometimes maybe you see, especially for the rich, for the poor, these kind of channels of negotiation can be highly differentiated. I think that's the interesting part. But my general, comment. One is I agree with two other panelists. I think we're facing a really important moment for Chinese economy and Chinese society in general, in the sense that in the past 40 years, the focus has always been growth. But we know development is different from growth. Development is larger than growth, right? To use this great Indian economist, Amartya Sen's work, development as a freedom. It is more than economic growth, more than GDP numbers. And I'm really, strong believer of that. I think now it's time for Chinese government actually to build and strengthen the welfare system in order to provide a more sustainable, more healthier pattern of urbanization for its people. Also for the sake of maintaining its, effective governance of the country. Second thing I want to mention, I think Professor Wu and Dr. Wang also mentioned the geopolitical issue. I think although cities are local entities, they are situated in this national context. So I think the national development strategy is critically important for understanding urban policy. And also I think cities and their nations are in this global context. So I think to look at their international intervention is also critically important. So for instance, we know when Chinese government faces more challenges domestically, they actually become more outgoing, such as the Belt Road Initiative, as we know, right? So a student of mine studying how the Belt Road Initiative is influencing cities, participating in this program in different countries. So I think that's really this interesting thing for us to observe, how China's domestic versus external foreign investment can have this joint impact on Chinese urban economy. And lastly, I totally agree with Professor Wu that this kind of cross-national comparison is much needed. Well, it is interesting to do, right? Who doesn't want to travel to India? Who doesn't want to travel to China? But also I think, countries, especially the emerging economies, they can really learn from each other because they are facing some very similar challenges. People in comparative politics often say, you don't understand yourself until you see others, until you see how others do their business. So I really, look forward to more comparative study and also more dialogue, even collaboration with Professor Wu, with Dr. Wang, and also my, Indian and colleagues from India and also from elsewhere. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yue. Your political science sort of perspective also is extremely important. May I now finally turn to Kirti Bhai, who's a traditional closer of all in-half workshops. And since it's a joint workshop with the Institute of Chinese Studies and in-half, I will not exercise the rules of my home institution, the Center for Policy Research, but Professor Kirti Bhai, floor is yours to close the workshop. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here with us. It's late in Hong Kong, and thank you so much, Tao, for staying up, for Professor Wu for missing your lunch, and Yue for getting up so early, and all the audience here and perhaps online elsewhere for being with us through this workshop. Kirti Bhai, all yours.
Thank you, Partha. Let me ask you a reverse question. A question that I should ask myself, and that is this: that we have overshot by about 18 minutes, and I did a very interesting exercise for this meeting because we were talking about real estate industry in China. I rang up about 7 or 8 real estate people who do real estate really. Those who buy lands, who create properties, who take risk, who really kind of ask problems and ask them to kind of see what would they like to know from this panel on Chinese cities. And I have about 10 questions, but I understand there is no time for doing that. So I would probably write down and send a note to all of them saying these are the kind of questions that real estate people wanted to know from the experts who know real estate and cities in China. I really wanted the time to do that, and I'm sorry for that. But let me kind of say 2 things. One is this, that let me tell all the panelists that we have been running this series now for 15 months on one overarching theme, and that is called Rethinking Cities. And we have had all kind of issues being discussed and debated and conversations taken place. We had something like 350 experts from different fields come and share their experiences and perspectives and views. And one very important was missing on China. And therefore, I'm very delighted that finally we got 3 very highly talented experts from different parts of the world to talk about Chinese cities. So I'm very grateful to Partha ji. I have been talking to Partha for about a year to put this meeting together. For one or the other reason, it was not happening, but I'm very glad finally that has happened. So thank you very much, Partha Sahab. Thank you also, Institute of Chinese Study, for making this possible, making us partners, and really kind of have the benefit of learning so much. Let me thank all the 3 panelists personally, Dr. Fulong Wu, Yu Zhang, and Tao Wang, for this incredibly rich exposition and sharing of ideas and understanding. It's been very, very useful. What I would do is, if you allow me to do this, I would put together these questions that real estate people had asked me. Of course, some of them have been answered. Like, say, first major question was on land. There was a question on vacancy rate. There was a questions, on rental housing. There were some of them have been answered. Some of them have not been kind of looked at, like building bylaws, regulatory framework, role of the state in managing land, and all kind of things that have not been done. So I will write them down and send to you, so that if you have time, and at least you could respond, and I'll see that it reaches the people who asked that question. So with that, a sort of a promise and that sort of request that you will respond, we will end this meeting. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Shruti ji, I think, at the Institute of Chinese Studies. And thank you, Ankisha at INHAF for managing this very well. Thank you.